The air on the first Tuesday of November 1982 had the sharp, metallic bite of impending winter. It was the kind of cold that seeped right through a man's canvas work coat and settled deep in his bones. For Jedediah Stone, the chill felt like it was coming from inside. A frozen dread that had taken root in his gut the day the certified letter arrived from the bank. Now, standing at the edge of his own farmstead, he watched as his life was sold off, piece by gleaming piece. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Curtis, who Jed had known since grade school, was perched on a flatbed trailer, his voice a rhythmic, hypnotic chant that rolled across the assembled crowd of neighbors, vultures, and curious onlookers. His breath plumed in the grey air. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this beauty?" A 1980 John Deere 4640, quad-range transmission, 3 remotes, just over 1,400 hours on the tack. The paint's barely faded on this one, boys. Who'll start the bidding at 40,000? 40? Do I hear 40? Jed's 4640. He'd bought it brand new 2 years ago, the pride of his fleet. He remembered the smell of the new plastic and vinyl in the Soundguard cab, the satisfying hiss of the hydraulics, the sheer, unadulterated power of that 466 cubic inch turbocharged diesel engine pulling a 24-foot disc through black Iowa soil like it was garden dirt. It was the tractor that was supposed to secure his family's future. Now it was just another asset to be liquidated. A hand went up. 40,000. I got 40. Who'll give me 41? 41. Thank you, sir. Now 42. Jed didn't watch the bidders. He knew who they were. Some were good men, looking for a fair deal. Others were predators, circling a wounded animal. He kept his eyes fixed on the man standing off to the side, leaning against the fender of a brand-new Ford F-250, arms crossed over his chest. Richard Miller. Rich's land bordered Jed's to the west. He farmed 1,000 acres to Jed's 400, and he did it with a line of equipment that looked like it belonged on a showroom floor. He wasn't bidding. He didn't need to. He was just here to watch. A small, smug smile played on his lips as the price for Jed's tractor climbed. It was a look that said, "I told you so." Jed's gaze drifted past Rich, past the rows of solemn faces, to the line of machinery arrayed in the barnyard. His 44-440 tractor, his 7720 combine, the one he'd only put 2 seasons on, the 6-bottom plow, the planter, the grain wagons. A whole lifetime of ambition, paid for with the bank's money, all lined up for the chopping block. The green and yellow paint seemed to mock him, a bright, cheerful color for a day of utter ruin. The auctioneer's hammer fell. Sold. For $47,500 to the gentleman in the red cap. Congratulations, sir. You bought yourself one heck of a tractor. Jed felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He'd paid $65,000 for it. The bank would eat the loss and add it to the mountain of debt that was still crushing him. He shoved his calloused hands deeper into his coat pockets, the worn fabric a familiar comfort in a world turned upside down. It hadn't always been this way. His father, Thomas Stone, had farmed this same land with a Farmall M and a 2-bottom plow. He'd taught Jed the value of a dollar earned and a debt avoided. "Never owe a man for something the rain can wash away," he used to say. For years, Jed had followed that advice. He'd farmed with his father's patched-up equipment, slowly, methodically, paying cash for every used Oliver or Alice Chalmers he added to the shed. He was small, but he was his own man. Then the 70s had hit. Grain prices shot to the moon. Russia was buying wheat, the government was telling everyone to plant fence row to fence row, and land values were doubling every few years. The bankers, who once looked at farmers with suspicion, were now showing up in shiny sedans, offering money with a smile and a firm handshake. Rich Miller was the first to dive in head first. He mortgaged his family's original homestead to buy up 2 neighboring farms. He built towering grain bins and filled a new machine shed with the biggest iron international harvester had to offer. At the co-op coffee shop, he'd talk about leverage and depreciation and cash flow. Words that sounded foreign and dangerous to Jed. "You're sitting on a gold mine, Jed," Rich had told him one spring morning, gesturing at Jed's fields. "That land is worth 3 times what you paid for it. It's lazy money just sitting there. You gotta put it to work. Get big or get out." Jed had resisted, but the pressure was immense. The old equipment was slow, breakdowns were frequent. Watching Rich plow 100 acres in a day, while Jed struggled to do 30, was a bitter pill to swallow. The final push came from the banker himself, a man named Henderson who showed up with a folder full of numbers. He showed Jed his net worth on paper, a staggering figure that didn't feel real. "Let's put that equity to work, Jed. Let's modernize, increase your efficiency." He'd finally given in. He signed the papers. The next week, the semi-trucks arrived, unloading a fleet of brand-new John Deere green. It felt like victory. For 2 years it was. He farmed more acres, did it faster, and sat in an air-conditioned cab listening to the radio. He was finally keeping up with Rich Miller. Then the world turned. Interest rates, which had been manageable, began to climb with terrifying speed. 10%, 15%, 18%. The grain embargo hit and commodity prices plummeted. The gold mine of his land equity turned into a sinkhole. The payments on those shiny green machines, once a stretch, became an impossibility. The friendly banker's voice turned cold and firm. And then came the letter. "Last item of the day, folks." Bill Curtis's voice broke through Jed's reverie. "We've got an old-timer tucked away behind the shed. A Steiger Bearcat 2. 4-wheel drive articulated, as is, where is. We don't have the key, and I'm told it hasn't run in years. We're selling it for scrap. Who'll give me $100? Silence. Jed turned. He'd almost forgotten about it. He'd bought the hulking beast 5 years ago at a consignment sale. A moment of weakness. It was a relic from the early days of high-horsepower farming, powered by a big Caterpillar diesel. His plan had been to fix it up, a winter project. But then the new Deeres had arrived, and the old Steiger was pushed to the fence row and forgotten, left for the rust and the mice. $100, folks? The tires alone are worth that. "Who'll give me 100? Bill pleaded. The crowd was thinning, their appetites for tragedy satisfied. $50, someone yelled from the back, followed by a chuckle. "I got 50, who'll give me 75? Jed looked at the tractor. It was massive, an ugly, powerful brute from a different era. Its faded green paint was a pale imitation of the John Deere color, peeling away to reveal a decade of rust. The windows were clouded, one of them cracked. But it was built out of thick plate steel, not styled plastic. It was made to pull, not to look pretty. Something stirred in him, a stubborn, foolish flicker of defiance. They had taken his future. They had taken his pride. They would not take the last forgotten remnant of his past. $100, Jed said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the cold, still air. Every head turned to look at him. Bill Curtis paused, his professional rhythm broken. Rich Miller straightened up from his truck, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. "I've got 100 from Mr. Stone," Bill said, a note of pity in his voice. "Do I hear 125? Silence. No one was going to bid against a man buying back his own junk at his own funeral. "Sold." Bill's hammer fell, the sound unnaturally loud. "To Jed Stone for $100. Jed walked to the clerk's table, pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, and counted out 5 $20 bills. It was almost the last of his cash. He took the receipt, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't look at anyone. He walked past the empty spaces where his new tractors had sat, past the silent combine, and headed for the fence row where the ugly green monster waited. As he walked, he could feel Rich Miller's eyes on his back, burning with a mixture of pity and contempt. He could already hear the talk at the coffee shop tomorrow. Poor Jed Stone. Lost everything. So desperate he paid $100 for his own scrap iron. Let them talk. Before we go any further, before we see if this old beast can ever roar to life again, I've got to ask you all something. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Backed into a corner, everything on the line, and you do something that makes no sense to anyone but you. Maybe you bought something back at your own auction, something nobody else wanted, but that meant the world to you. Let me know in the comments down below. I read every one of them. The days that followed the auction were the quietest Jed had ever known. The familiar rumble of a diesel engine was gone, replaced by the lonesome sound of the wind whistling around the corners of the barn. The farm felt empty, hollowed out. His wife, Martha, moved with a heavy heart, her face etched with worry, but she never spoke a word of blame. She'd just put a hot plate of food in front of him at the end of the day and rest her hand on his shoulder for a moment, a silent promise that he wasn't in this alone. His son, David, who was 16 and had grown up with the hum of modern machinery, was lost. He'd loved driving the 4440. He wandered the farm like a ghost, kicking at dirt clods, the future he'd imagined for himself, taking over a thriving modern operation, evaporating before his eyes. The bank had been professional. Mr. Henderson had explained the restructuring. They weren't taking the land, not yet. The proceeds from the auction had paid down a chunk of the operating note, but the long-term mortgage was still there, now secured by the land itself. The interest rate was locked in at a crippling 17%. They owned him. Every bushel of corn, every bean he grew, would have a piece of it carved out for the bank before he ever saw a dime. To grow anything, he needed equipment. One morning, after a breakfast of silent coffee and toast, Jed walked out to the old machine shed at the far end of the yard. It was a place he'd neglected for years, a relic from his father's time. The big sliding doors groaned in protest as he heaved them open, the screech of rusty rollers echoing in the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom. And there they were, the ghosts of a bygone era. Covered in a thick blanket of dust and bird droppings was his father's 1951 Farmall M, its faded red paint barely visible. Its narrow front wheels and simple open operator's station looked impossibly primitive. Beside it sat an Oliver 1650 gas tractor he'd bought in the early 70s, its meadow green paint now dull and chalky. In the back corner, under a rotten canvas tarp, was the first tractor he'd ever owned, a little John Deere B, with its distinctive putt-putt two-cylinder engine. This was his inheritance. This was what he had left. A collection of museum pieces. David followed him into the shed, his hands in his pockets. "What are you going to do with this junk, Dad?" he asked, his voice flat. "You can't farm 400 acres with a Farmall M." "My father did," Jed said, running a hand over the Farmall's dusty hood. "Farmed this very ground." "Yeah, but that was 30 years ago. He was growing 80 bushel corn. We need 200 bushels just to pay the interest on the land. You can't pull a modern chisel plow with that thing. It'd be like trying to pull a freight train with a pony." He was right, of course. The implements he had left were just as old. A 4-bottom pull-type plow, a 10-foot disc. A 4-row planter. Using them would be a slow, agonizing process. He'd never get the crop in on time. "That's where the Steiger comes in," Jed said, more to himself than to his son. He spent the next week dragging the giant tractor from the fence row. He used the Oliver, its old 6-cylinder Waukesha gas engine, coughing and sputtering to life after years of silence, to pull the Steiger into the workshop. The thing was a monster. It filled the entire bay. Its 8 massive tires were dry-rotted and flat, the rims rusted to the hubs. The first task was the engine. It was a Caterpillar 3306, a legendary inline-6 diesel known for its reliability. But this one was seized up tight. Jed pulled the injectors and poured a coffee can full of Marvel Mystery Oil into each cylinder, hoping the penetrating fluid would work its magic on the rusted piston rings. He left it to soak for 3 days. In the meantime, he and David attacked the rest of the machine. They drained the hydraulic fluid, which came out looking like chocolate milk, a sure sign of water contamination. They pulled the filters, clogged solid with sludge. Every grease zerk was packed with hardened, sun-baked dirt. The wiring was a rat's nest, the insulation chewed away by generations of mice who had made a home in the dashboard. "This is hopeless," David said on the 3rd day, holding up a hydraulic hose that had cracked and split like an old snakeskin. "Nothing's hopeless," Jed replied, his voice gruff as he scraped a gasket off a filter housing. "It's just work." He sent David to the parts store in town with a list. The boy came back an hour later, his face grim. "Mr. Henderson at the Napa store said most of these parts are obsolete. He can't get them." Jed just nodded and wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "Then we'll go to the junkyard." The next Saturday, they drove the old Ford pickup 30 miles to a sprawling tractor salvage yard. It was a graveyard of ambition, rows upon rows of rusting machines, their parts cannibalized, their engines silent. They spent the entire day walking through the muddy rows, looking for a donor Steiger. They found one near the back, a burned-out husk, but the hydraulic pump looked salvageable and many of the hoses were intact. Jed haggled with the owner, a grizzled man with a glass eye, and they loaded up the parts for $150. Money he didn't have, charged to his account at the co-op. Another entry in the ever-growing ledger of his debt. Back in the shop, the real work began. Jed taught David how to heat and bend steel to fabricate new brackets, how to carefully splice wires and seal them with electrical tape, how to read the wear on a bearing. He showed him how to use a 3/4-inch drive breaker bar, putting a 6-foot pipe on the end for leverage to break loose bolts that hadn't been turned in a decade. It was slow, frustrating work. Knuckles were busted, tempers flared. More than once, David threw a wrench across the concrete floor in disgust. "I can't do this. It's all just rust and junk." "Pick up the wrench," Jed would say, his voice calm and steady. "And get back to work. This is the price, son. This is the price for wanting things you haven't earned yet." After a week of soaking, Jed put the big breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt at the front of the Caterpillar engine. He put all his weight on it. Nothing. He and David both hung off the pipe. The bar bent, the steel groaning in protest, but the engine wouldn't budge. It was seized solid. A boat anchor. David slumped against the workbench. "It's over." Jed stared at the engine, the grease and oil on his hands seeming to mock him. He felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled his knees. Maybe David was right. Maybe Rich Miller was right. Maybe this was all just a fool's errand. But then he looked at his father's old tools hanging on the pegboard. The perfectly organized wrenches, the hammers with their worn wooden handles shaped by a lifetime of use. His father had faced droughts, floods, and depressions. He'd never given up. "It's not over," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "Get the Oliver. We're gonna pull start it." "Dad, you can't pull start a seized engine. You'll break something. You'll tear the whole rear end out of the Oliver." "Get the tractor," Jed repeated, his eyes fixed on the Steiger with a grim determination. He was going to make this machine run, or he was going to break it in half trying. The story of Jed Stone's fall was the main course at the farmer's co-op coffee shop for weeks. His name was spoken in hushed, sympathetic tones, the kind reserved for the dead or the damned. He was a cautionary tale, a walking ghost of the go-go 70s. The men who gathered there every morning, nursing their mugs and dissecting the markets, had all felt the same temptations. They had all seen the glossy brochures for bigger tractors, all listened to the siren song of the bankers. Jed was just the first one in their corner of the county to go under. Rich Miller held court at the center table. He never gloated, not overtly. He was too smart for that. Instead, he'd shake his head sadly. "It's a crying shame," he'd say, stirring his coffee. "Jed's a good man, a hard worker. He just got in over his head. You can't let your emotions run a business. The numbers have to work. He expanded too fast, leveraged himself too thin." Everyone would nod in agreement, conveniently forgetting that they had been doing the exact same thing for the past 5 years. Rich was thriving. The high interest rates that were strangling Jed were a boon for Rich, who had locked in his long-term loans years earlier at a much lower rate. The falling commodity prices hurt, but his sheer scale and efficiency gave him a cushion. That spring, while Jed was wrestling with the rusted guts of the Steiger, Rich bought the 80-acre parcel of land that bordered Jed's southern fence line. He paid cash for it, money he'd made from a bumper crop the year before. The first thing he did was tear out the old fence row, the same one where the Steiger had been rusting away. He used a massive bulldozer, piling the old Osage orange trees into a heap and setting them ablaze. The smoke drifted over Jed's farmstead for a week, a constant, acrid reminder of his neighbor's success and his own failure. Rich's new fleet of International Harvester tractors, a massive 5.488 and an articulated 2+2, worked that new field from dawn until long after dusk. Their halogen lights cut through the darkness, sweeping across Jed's own unplowed fields. The deep, throaty roar of their big diesel engines was a constant taunt, a soundtrack of progress while Jed's farm lay silent and fallow. Jed had finally caved in the summer of '79. It was a brutally hot July afternoon. He'd been cultivating corn with the old Oliver 1650, sitting on the hot steel seat, breathing dust and diesel fumes. The tractor had no cab, no air conditioning, no radio, just the relentless sun and the monotonous roar of the engine. Across the road, Rich Miller was cultivating his own corn in his brand-new International 1086, a gleaming red machine with a quiet, air-conditioned cab. Rich was wearing a clean shirt and listening to the ball game on the radio. He gave Jed a little wave as he passed. It wasn't a mean gesture, but to Jed it felt like the deepest insult he'd ever received. That evening he'd called the bank. He remembered the day the John Deeres were delivered. David, then just a boy of 13, had stood with his eyes wide, watching the massive 4640 back off the semi-trailer. It looked like a machine from the future. Jed had hoisted him up into the cab, the boy's hands tentatively touching the array of levers and buttons. "One day this will all be yours," Jed had told him, a lump of pride in his throat. The first year was magical. The power, the speed, the comfort. He ploughed, planted and harvested his 400 acres in a fraction of the time it used to take. He even did some custom work for a neighbor, the extra income easily making the first year's payment. He felt smart, powerful and modern. He had finally caught up. He and Rich Miller were peers, two men at the forefront of modern agriculture. But there was a difference. Rich owned his success. Jed was merely renting his. Now, in the cold reality of 1982, Jed and David chained the front of the Steiger to the drawbar of the old Oliver. The Oliver's tires dug into the gravel of the driveway, its engine straining. Jed put the Steiger in a high gear, the idea being that the forward motion of the tractor would be forced backward through the transmission and turn the engine over, breaking it free. "You're going to kill the Oliver," David shouted over the screaming engine. "Just pull," Jed yelled back. He let out the clutch on the Steiger. The chain snapped taut with a sound like a gunshot. The Oliver's rear wheels spun, digging trenches in the drive, but the Steiger didn't budge. The seized engine was an anchor holding it fast. The Oliver's engine began to bog down, the exhaust turning black with unburnt fuel. Jed waved his hand frantically. "Stop! Stop!" David killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal and Jed's own ragged breathing. He had failed. It was over. All the work, all the busted knuckles, all the money spent on junk parts, it was all for nothing. He leaned his forehead against the cold steering wheel of the Steiger, the smell of old vinyl and mouse droppings filling his nostrils. A profound and utter sense of defeat washed over him. He heard the crunch of gravel as a vehicle pulled into his driveway. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. The deep, rumbling idle of a big V8 engine could only belong to Rich Miller's new Ford pickup. Rich got out and walked over, stopping a few feet away. He looked at the two tractors chained together, at the trenches dug in the driveway, at Jed slumped over the steering wheel. "Having some trouble there, Jed?" he asked. His voice wasn't mean, but it was thick with a condescending pity that was far worse. Jed slowly lifted his head and looked at the man who represented everything he had tried to become and everything he had lost. "Engines seized up," Jed said, his voice hoarse. Rich shook his head, a sad, knowing smile on his face. Jed, when are you going to learn? You can't build a future with junk. Sometimes you just have to know when to quit. The bank will give you a fair price for scrap. Cut your losses. It's the smart play." Jed stared at him, then looked past him at the fields Rich now owned, ploughed and ready for planting. He looked at Rich's clean clothes and his expensive truck. And then he looked at his own son, David, standing by the old Oliver, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Something inside Jed Stone, something hard and stubborn that had been beaten down and buried, finally broke free. It wasn't anger, it was a cold, clear resolve. He wasn't just fighting to save a tractor, he was fighting to save his son from believing that Rich Miller was right. Jed slowly got off the Steiger's seat, his boots landing on the gravel with a soft crunch. He ignored Rich's gleaming truck and the man standing beside it. He walked over to David, who was leaning against the Oliver, the picture of youthful defeat. Jed put a heavy, grease-stained hand on his son's shoulder. "Go to the shop," he said, his voice low and steady. "On the top shelf of the steel cabinet, there's a hydraulic porta power set in a black metal box. Bring it here." and bring the half-inch thick steel plate sitting by the welder. David looked at him, confused. What for? Just get it. Rich Miller watched, a frown of puzzlement replacing his smug smile. He couldn't comprehend what Jed was doing. The man was beaten. The smart play, the only play, was to surrender. David returned, lugging the heavy hydraulic hand pump and ram, the steel plate under his other arm. Now what? He asked. We're going to make that piston move, Jed said. He grabbed a wrench and began to unbolt the fuel injector from the number 1 cylinder of the big Caterpillar engine. It was a simple direct injection system, and once the injector was out, it left a threaded hole leading directly to the top of the seized piston. For the next hour, Jed and David worked with a focus that blocked out the world. They cut a small square from the steel plate with an acetylene torch, the hissing flame a stark contrast to the quiet afternoon. Jed drilled a hole in its center and welded a threaded fitting onto it that matched the hose from the porta-power. He then bolted the plate over the injector port, creating a sealed chamber. Rich hadn't left. He stood there, arms crossed, watching this bizarre roadside repair with a kind of morbid curiosity. It was like watching a man try to build a raft from driftwood after his ship had already sunk. "You're going to blow a head gasket right out the side of that block, Jed," Rich said, unable to keep the advice out of his voice. "There's a reason mechanics don't do this." "The reason they don't do it," Jed said without looking up, tightening the last bolt, "is because it's cheaper for a man with money to just buy a new engine. I don't have that luxury." He connected the hydraulic hose to the fitting. The porta-power was a tool for straightening bent truck frames, capable of exerting 10 tons of pressure. Jed intended to focus all of that force onto the top of one 6-inch wide piston. "Stand back, David," he said. He took the handle of the pump. He took a deep breath. He began to pump. The handle was easy at first, then it grew firm as the hose filled and pressure built in the cylinder. The steel of the engine block, a half-inch thick casting of iron and nickel, began to creak and groan under the immense, silent strain. The needle on the pressure gauge climbed, 1,000 psi, 2,000. The pump handle became harder to move. Jed put his whole body into each stroke, 5,000 psi. The groaning grew louder, a high-pitched metallic scream of stressed metal. "Dad, stop," David yelled. "It's going to explode." Jed ignored him. His eyes were fixed on the front of the engine, on the massive crankshaft pulley. He gave one more mighty heave on the pump handle. Crack. The sound was not an explosion. It was sharp, deep and final, like a giant oak tree splitting in a lightning storm. It echoed off the barn and rolled across the silent fields. The pressure gauge on the pump dropped to 0. The handle went limp in Jed's hand. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jed walked to the front of the tractor and put the 6-foot breaker bar back on the crankshaft bolt. He leaned into it, putting his weight against the pipe. This time it moved. It turned stiffly at first, with the grinding sound of rust breaking free, and then it became easier. The engine was free. David let out a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy. He ran over and threw his arms around his father, heedless of the grease and grime. Jed staggered back, a rare, tired smile cracking his face. He had won. It was a small victory in a very large war, but it was a victory nonetheless. Rich Miller just stared. He slowly shook his head, got into his truck without another word, and drove away. He didn't understand what he had just seen. He saw a man forcing a broken machine to work. He didn't see a father showing his son that you never, ever quit. The summer that followed was a trial by fire. A relentless, blistering heat settled over the heartland in late June and refused to leave. The sky turned a hazy, bleached-out white, and the rain simply stopped. The corn, which had sprung from the earth full of promise, began to suffer. Its broad green leaves curled inward during the day, trying to conserve moisture, a posture of prayer for a rain that never came. Rich Miller's fields, planted with the latest high-yield hybrid seeds, were the first to show the strain. Those varieties were bred for ideal conditions, plenty of fertilizer, and most importantly, plenty of water. They were racehorses, and in the dry heat they were starting to falter. Jed, out of necessity, had bought a few bags of a cheaper, open-pollinated corn variety from an old farmer over in the next county. It was the kind of corn that wouldn't win any awards, but it had deep roots and a stubborn will to live. The Steiger became the heart of Jed's operation. It was ugly, loud, and uncomfortable. The cab leaked dust, the air conditioning was long dead, and the seat was torn, its foam stuffing poking through. But the big Caterpillar engine, now that it was running, was unstoppable. It would start with a plume of black smoke and settle into a low, throbbing idle that seemed to make the ground tremble. Jed used it to pull his father's old 24-foot field cultivator, working the ground deep to conserve what little moisture was there. It was slow work, but it was steady. He didn't have payments, he only had fuel costs, and the old cat, lugging down at low RPMs, was surprisingly thrifty. One afternoon in July, Jed was tinkering with the carburetor on the old Farmall M when he saw trouble across the fence. Rich's massive International 5488, the pride of his fleet, was sitting dead in the middle of a field, a cloud of black smoke hanging over it. A service truck from the dealership was parked beside it. Jed watched for a while as the mechanic in his clean uniform scratched his head and talked on a two-way radio. The tractor didn't move. The next day, it was still there. And the day after that. The talk at the co-op was that the 5088 had thrown a rod right through the side of the engine block. A new engine was $25,000, and there wasn't one available west of the Mississippi. Rich's biggest tractor, the one he relied on for the heavy work, was out of commission for the rest of the season. The first cracks in the empire were beginning to show. Rich had to hire a neighbor to finish his planting, a humiliating and expensive ordeal. His crop went in late, into soil that was getting drier by the day. As the drought wore on, Jed's fields held their color, a dusty, resilient green, while Rich's began to fire, the lower leaves turning a sickly yellow-brown. The numbers on paper, the ones that celebrated efficiency and scale, were beginning to collide with the hard, unforgiving reality of the land and the weather. Jed, with his junk heap tractor and his old-fashioned seed, was holding his own. The fall of 1983 arrived not with the crisp relief of autumn, but with the dry, rasping breath of a dying season. The drought had broken all records. Corn stalks stood stunted and brittle in the fields, their ears small and poorly filled. For farmers across the Midwest, it was a catastrophe. For those leveraged to the hilt, it was a death sentence. The news from the Federal Reserve was grim. To combat inflation, interest rates were being held at punishingly high levels. The prime rate hovered near 20%. Banks, which had once thrown money at farmers, were now calling in their loans with a ruthless urgency. Foreclosure notices, once a rarity, were being tacked to the doors of county courthouses every week. The farm crisis had become a full-blown collapse. Rich Miller was caught in the perfect storm. His crop yield was a disaster, less than half of what he had projected. The low commodity prices meant that even if he'd had a bumper crop, he would have struggled. But with a poor harvest, the numbers were impossible. His massive operating loan, taken out in the spring to cover the exorbitant cost of seed, fertilizer, and fuel for his 1,000 acres, was due. He didn't have the money. His banker, Mr. Henderson, was no longer the smiling man who talked about equity and growth. He was a man under pressure from his own superiors, tasked with cleaning up the bank's balance sheet. He looked at Rich Miller's file and saw not a successful farmer, but a toxic asset. The bank called the loan. When Rich couldn't pay, they began foreclosure proceedings on the entire operation. The land, the grain bins, the house, everything. Jed heard the news at the co-op. The men spoke of it in hushed tones. Rich Miller, the man who had been the very model of modern farming, was being sold out. There was no triumph in their voices, only fear. If it could happen to Rich, it could happen to any of them. Jed, by contrast, was surviving. His corn yield was low, but it was far better than his neighbors. The old-fashioned seed had proven its worth. After the harvest, which he and David managed with his father's old two-row corn picker, pulled by the Oliver, he had enough grain to sell to make the annual interest payment on his land mortgage. It was a staggering sum of money that represented nearly every dollar of profit he'd made. But he made it. He wasn't gaining ground, but he wasn't losing any more either. He was holding the line. His operating costs for the year had been a fraction of Rich's. He'd bought no new parts, only oil and filters. His fertilizer bill was modest. His biggest expense was diesel fuel for the Steiger. He had survived not by being smart or efficient in the modern sense, but by being cheap, stubborn, and independent. His father's words echoed in his mind. Never owe a man for something the rain can wash away. The drought had washed away an entire generation of debt-fueled dreams, but Jed's humble, paid-for operation was still standing. The day of Rich Miller's auction was a grey, windswept day in November, almost a year to the day since Jed's own sale. Jed drove his old Ford pickup and parked along the road. He walked into the yard and saw the familiar scene. The auctioneer on the flatbed trailer, the rows of equipment lined up, the crowd of solemn neighbors and sharp-eyed opportunists. Rich's equipment was beautiful. Gleaming red International Harvester tractors, a massive combine with a 24-foot grain head, planters that could sow 12 rows at a time. It was a fleet built for conquering the land, but it had conquered its owner instead. Jed watched as the 2+2 articulated tractor, a machine that had cost Rich over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $35,000. The bank would take the money, apply it to the debt, and Rich would still owe a fortune. He saw Rich standing by the machine shed, his wife beside him. He wasn't the confident, commanding figure Jed had always known. He was a ghost, a hollowed-out man watching his life be dismantled. His gaze met Jed's across the crowd. There was no animosity in his eyes, no contempt. Only a deep, bottomless well of despair and a flicker of something else. A desperate, dawning understanding. Jed didn't stay long. He had seen this tragedy before. He had lived it. He got back in his truck and drove home, the auctioneer's rhythmic chant fading behind him. He knew that the land, the Miller family's home quarter, would be the last thing to sell. The final act of the Miller farm auction took place the following Saturday. The machinery was gone, and now the land itself was on the block. Jed went, though he wasn't sure why. Martha had packed him a thermos of coffee. He stood at the back of the crowd, a solitary figure in a worn canvas coat. The auctioneer was selling the farm in parcels. The first was the 80-acre field that bordered Jed's southern fence line, the very one Rich had bought and cleared with such fanfare. All right, folks, a prime piece of ground right here. 80 acres, lays flat, good black dirt. What am I bid? Who'll start it at $1,000 an acre? The bidding was slow, land values had plummeted. The gold mine of the 70s had become a minefield. The price crept up, $1,200 an acre, $1,300. Jed had been doing the math in his head for weeks. He and Martha had lived on almost nothing for a year. They'd sold off a few old hogs, and Martha had sold countless dozens of eggs and jars of canned vegetables at the farmer's market in town. Jed had used his welder to repair equipment for 3 different neighbors, taking a little cash and a lot of bartered goods in return. They had scraped together a small nest egg, a few $1,000s tucked away in a coffee can. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. It was real money, not a banker's promise. The bidding stalled at $1,400 an acre, a total of $112,000. It was a fortune, an impossible sum. But Jed knew the bank was desperate. They weren't selling it for cash. They were offering financing contracts to anyone with a decent down payment. $1,400 once, $1,400 twice, the auctioneer called out. Jed thought of Rich's bulldozer tearing out the old fence row. He thought of the halogen lights sweeping across his dark fields. He thought of the condescending pity in Rich's voice that day in the driveway. And then he thought of his own son, David, and the future of the Stone family farm. He raised his hand. $1,450, he said, his voice clear and firm. A murmur went through the crowd. Jed Stone, the man who had lost everything, was bidding on his rival's land. The other bidder, a wealthy investor from the city, looked back at Jed, shook his head, and turned away. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a crack that sealed the deal. To Jedediah Stone for $1,450 an acre. Jed felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He walked forward to the clerk's table, his face a mask of grim determination. He signed the papers, his hand steady. He was taking on debt again, but this time it was different. It was a debt for land, for something real and eternal, not for a piece of depreciating iron. It was a calculated risk, taken from a position of hard-won wisdom, not naive ambition. After the sale was over, he found Rich standing alone by the empty barn, staring out at the land that was no longer his. He looked up as Jed approached, his face pale and drawn. "I suppose you've come to gloat," Rich said, his voice raspy. "No," Jed said quietly. "I came to offer you a job." Rich stared at him, his mouth agape. "A job?" "I'm going to have 160 extra acres to farm next spring," Jed said. "That old Steiger can handle it, but I can't do it all myself. It's hard work, and the pay won't be much, but it's honest work, and I could use a man who knows his way around an international engine." Tears welled in Rich Miller's eyes. The pride that had defined him for so long finally crumbled, replaced by a wave of raw, humbling gratitude. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. It was an admission of defeat, but also the beginning of a strange and unlikely redemption. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip on the heartland. The rains returned. Commodity prices began a slow, unsteady climb back toward profitability. Jed Stone's farm became an unlikely beacon in the community. The story of how he had resurrected the old Steiger and bought back his neighbor's land became a local legend, told and retold over coffee at the co-op. The talk there had changed. The men spoke less of leverage and cash flow and more of repair costs and resilience. They started asking Jed's advice, not about getting bigger, but about how to keep their older, paid-for equipment running. The tide of opinion had turned. The stubborn, old-fashioned farmer was now seen as a visionary. Jed and Rich formed an unlikely partnership. They worked side by side, the two of them wrestling with the old machinery, nursing it through each season. The Steiger was their warhorse, its faded paint and jury-rigged repairs a testament to their shared struggle. They never became close friends in the traditional sense. There was too much history between them. But a deep, unspoken respect grew. They were two survivors, bound together by the land they both loved. One cool evening in the fall of 1989, Jed stood in the doorway of the machine shop. The farm was quiet. He was debt-free. He had paid off the contract on the 80 acres and had even managed to buy back another 40 of his original parcel. He hadn't built an empire, but he had built a fortress. Inside the shop, bathed in the warm glow of a single bare bulb, his son David, now a grown man with grease on his hands that mirrored his father's, was bent over the engine of the old Farmall M. He had taken it completely apart and was rebuilding it with the meticulous care of a surgeon. The boy had become a master mechanic, his understanding of the old iron far surpassing Jed's. "She'll be running like a top by morning," David said without looking up. "I know she will," Jed replied, a deep sense of pride in his voice. He watched his son torque a headbolt, his movements sure and confident. The lessons had been learned, not in a classroom, but here, on this concrete floor, with busted knuckles and the smell of oil in the air. "You know," David said, wiping his hands on a rag, "I was thinking about what you told me Rich Miller said to you. You can't build a future with junk." He looked around the shop, at the old, simple machines. He was wrong. You can't build a future with debt. The junk is what saved us. Jed nodded slowly. He looked past his son, out the open door of the shop, across the fields that stretched out into the twilight. The land was his. The tools were his. The future, for the first time in a long time, was his to shape. He thought of his own father and the simple, powerful truth he had lived by. "He was a smart man, your grandfather," Jed said, his voice thick with emotion. "He always said, 'Never owe a man for something the rain can wash away.'" David met his father's gaze, and in his eyes, Jed saw that the legacy was secure. The land, the knowledge, the hard-won wisdom, it would all endure. The quiet hum of the land and the distant call of a whippoorwill were the only sounds. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of home.